Hi guys, and welcome to this step-by-step watercolour landscape tutorial where I use 8 techniques to really bring this painting to life. I really hope you're going to enjoy it. Let's get started. So I'm just finishing off the sketch for my painting. I'm using an HB pencil on 300 grams cold pressed watercolour paper on a block, and I've actually taped some washi tape around the border so you get a nice sort of white border when you finish the painting. It's a really nice way of presenting your work. I'm mixing up some cerulean and a little bit of violet. You can use cerulean mixed with a little touch of pink. I'm wetting the sky, use a large sort of round brush, really soak that sky. And my sort of first technique is going to be painting wet in wet. I'm starting off with the violet colour here. I'm dropping that in wet in wet. It's quite pale. I've really watered it down. It's just to give a hint of colour in those clouds there. I've left some white as well. And what happens when you paint wet in wet, you get soft edges. So I've loaded my brush with some cerulean. I've still left some little white gaps there for the clouds, and I'm painting the cerulean wet into wet, sort of over that sort of violet pinky area, and using the tip of my brush as I go towards the horizon, the marks become smaller, and this creates depth in your sky there. So the sort of stronger colours will be at the top of the sky, paler colours towards the horizon. I'm just rinsing my brush now, taking off the excess water, using this clean damp brush and just sort of softening away that dark line there and taking off any puddles as well. Just trying to avoid any backgrounds or cauliflowers that may appear later if I've got too much puddles or water in the sky area, or any other area for that matter. So I'm mixing up a little bit of phthalo blue here with a touch of hooker's green, using my size 10 brush, just a touch more of the phthalo blue. It's quite watery, it's quite a pale wash here. So the second technique I'm going to use is wax resist. This is a wax crayon. You can use a wax candle. I'm just rubbing it onto the watercolour paper here quite firmly. And what this will do, as you can see now, as I load my brush with this phthalo blue with a touch of green, wet on dry, you can see that the wax resist has resisted the paint to create a lovely sort of white wave effect in the water there. So it's really nice actually sort of reserving the light in your painting and also to create texture as well. I don't actually remove my wax afterwards. I leave it on there. I sort of look at it as a little bit of mixed media. I'm just softening the edges now, the hard edges, with a clean damp brush. I've added a touch more of hooker's green here using my size 8 brush, a little bit more of the phthalo blue, slightly milky consistency, about 50% blue, 50% green to give you a mid to dark green colour. I'm painting this in damp into wet. That means my brush isn't as wet as the surface of the paper, and I'm sprinkling in some table salt now onto the damp surface, and that will absorb the paint to create some lovely light textures. Do allow that to dry naturally. I'm working on the foreground now, mixing up a sort of light green, so about 70% yellow with about 30% of the blue to start with. I'm using my size 10 brush and I'm painting wet on dry, but sort of pushing in some of that mid green in there, sort of wet into wet. I've added a little bit of quinacridone gold, about 50% of that now, to that light green, and I'm sort of really loading my brush, painting wet on dry, sort of covering all of this foreground area. Always keep loading that brush, have plenty of paint. I've added in a little bit of blue now, about 50% again, to that sort of light green, and I'm painting this damp into wet here and there, again loading my brush. So I've got sort of various different greens on there, light and mid greens. And what I'm doing now is I'm getting a little bit more green, the hooker's green here, really loaded my brush so it's sort of a mid to dark colour here, painting this damp into wet, added some more Hooker's Green, literally 100% Hooker's Green into the damp surface here, and just sort of spreading that out with my brush. Added some more phthalo blue, about 50% to that Hooker's Green, to get some darker greens in the foreground. This is a little bit of black, and I'm painting this straight onto the dark green in the foreground, and I'm sprinkling on now some more table salt onto the damp surface, and I'm again going to allow that to dry naturally. So while that's drying naturally, I'm painting these distant hills here. I've started off with some quinacridone gold on its own, and I'm mixing in a touch of the cerulean here, really watered down, 50-50 really, the quinacridone gold with the cerulean, so you get quite a sort of a subtle green there. And I'm going back into the Hooker's Green there, painting that into the quinacridone gold, so you've got a sort of a light to mid green here, painting that damp into wet. And now I'm adding some ultramarine to the quinacridone gold, and it's about 50-50, painting this damp into damp on the left hand side. I'm getting a pinch of violet here with a touch of that green on my brush, painting this damp into damp in the foreground there, so it's quite dark there. So the green and violet mixed together creates a lovely natural looking colour there. So I'm not trying to copy the photograph as much, I'm interpreting it, and I'm getting lots of these yummy colours here. I'm adding a touch of burnt sienna to that violet there, painting that damp into damp. My fourth technique is to use some cling film or saran wrap, and I'm just placing that onto the wet surface there, and I'm sort of manipulating it to get sort of different marks. So do spend a little bit of time sort of creasing that cling film to get the desired marks there, you know, interesting marks. And I'm sort of pressing down with my fingers just to sort of get sort of creases where it will look like distant hills, etc., and pinching the cling film here and there. So don't sort of be afraid of sort of playing around with it just to see what happens. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually add some paint underneath the cling film, especially if you want some more dark there. So this is a little bit of the sort of violet with the brown with a touch of green, and I'm just painting this damp into damp back on to the hills here with my size 8 brush, just to get a little bit more darks and details here and there. Again, pressing down and manipulating that cling film to get the desired effects there. It's going to be accidental and random, but it's really good fun, and it really does create the look of distant fields on these hills here. So what I'm doing now, while that's drying off naturally, I'm painting the rooftop with my size 8 brush, wet on dry. And I've used a mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna. You can use burnt umber as well. And I'm just lifting up the cling film here just to get the top of the rooftop there. I don't want that cling film coming down too far. As you can see there, I've left little white gaps on the roof tiles there to give a little bit of light and texture. And I'm just going to paint in the windows now with the tip of this size 8 brush, leaving some white so it gives the impression of a white frame there as well. And you could use black or Paynes grey. This is a little bit of cerulean with the ultramarine and a touch of the burnt sienna. I'm just painting this for the doorway here, and this is wet on dry. It's a lovely cool blue door. This is some more ultramarine here with a tiny touch of the burnt sienna, so some shadows on the left hand side of the building. I'm also painting some darks, some Paynes grey on the left hand side, and I'm painting that dark damp into damp on top of the roof there and underneath the eaves with the tip of my size 8 brush. And I'm just sort of painting a few more darks just above the door. I'm peeling off the cling film now. It hasn't totally dried, but it has set, so you can test it. If you peel it off and it all runs back into itself, wait a little bit longer. So what I'm doing now is I'm using a little bit of cadmium yellow with a touch of the phthalo blue, painting a light to mid-green grasses around the farmhouse to the right hand side. To mix the green, I used about 60% of cadmium yellow and 40% of cerulean, and now I've added a little bit of quinacridone gold into that mixture there just to vary the colours. I've got a pinch of the Hooker's Green here with a touch of ultramarine, and I'm just painting this damp into wet there. So I've got some lovely luscious dark greens there at the top and a little bit more of the mid green at the bottom there. So what I'm using now for my fifth technique is the plastic card, and I'm drawing out some of that wet paint to create some thin grasses. So I'm painting on some of the Hooker's Green now, wet on dry, and I'm dropping in some quinacridone gold, and I'm working my way along the cliff edge here, wet on dry, varying the colours, again using the plastic card to pull out and draw out the paint to create some thin grasses. And it really pulls this sort of foreground now away from the sea, away from the middle distance and the background, dropping in some more dark colour here. This is a little bit of Paynes grey with the Hooker's Green, carefully working my way around the farm building here. So you've really got that dark against light. It really pulls out that light, and it is the focal point. And a good way of really sort of drawing your eye to the focal point is to have your darkest dark against your lightest light. It really brings it out. And I'm just using the tip of my brush here, working damp into damp, just painting some grasses and some darks here and there. So I'm working now on the left hand side using a mid green there, that's the yellow with the phthalo blue, about 50-50, using my size 12 round brush. I've added a little bit of sepia to that at the top, 100% sepia, dropping that into the damp paint so it sort of blends on the paper. And I'm using a dry brush technique now, it's really effective. So I've got some quinacridone gold, really creamy, so you don't want your brush too wet, and you want to swiftly brush the belly of the brush, not so much the tip, along that textured surface. So don't linger. Swiftness and speed is of the essence there, and it creates that lovely sort of broken colour effect there on the paper. So I'm dropping in a little bit of Paynes grey here, working damp into damp with the tip of my size 12 brush. And now I am using a sword liner brush and using the belly of that to sort of paint some trees here to the left. The paint is really creamy, thick and dark. I've used a bit of ultramarine with the Paynes grey here, and I'm just sort of working my way up, painting the branches, and towards the top I'm using dry brush again, so it's not much paint and very swift movement, so don't sort of press your brush too hard and you get this lovely dry brush effect, creating lots of texture at the top of that tree there, and it gives the impression of lots and lots of branches. So I've gone back in using the card now. The paint is damp and it allows me to lift off the paint to reveal some light there. So I'm actually pulling out some thin light branches and also pulling out a fence as well. So it's really effective, and some light in front of that little white house there, and sort of lifting out some light grasses as well. I've decided to paint over this little outbuilding here to the left to bring out the left side of the little white house here using a Paynes grey. And what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some ultramarine and a touch of burnt sienna, painting some shadow underneath the eaves, wet on dry. I'm mixing up a little bit of burnt umber here with a touch of ultramarine and just painting the distant shoreline here using the dry brush technique here to create a bit of dark and texture there, to give a little bit more information there. What's great when you use the cling film and you peel it off, you're left with these sort of random marks. You can then actually use those marks to sort of bring them to life, and that's what I'm doing here on the shoreline, just using these darks, and really sort of that dark will really bring that water out as well, because the water is so much lighter. I'm spattering the foreground with some cadmium yellow here to create the look of wild flowers. Spattering's great for creating light and texture and detail. I've also decided to paint a little bit more dark on the right hand side in the grasses there to really bring out the white building. you can see it really brings it to life, painting a few more darks in front of the white building there, leading the eye to the focal point, telling a story with these dark marks. I think it's a good time now though to allow my painting to dry. So as you can see, the painting's dry. The salt looks amazing now in the grasses and in the water. My last technique is a glazing technique where I'm going to paint very thin washes over the distant hills and some in the foreground as well. Now you can glaze a thin light wash over a much darker wash to change it, to push it back. So if you've got a very sort of warm area that's coming forward too much, you could glaze a thin wash of ultramarine over the top and it pushes it back. This is kind of what I'm doing here. I felt those background hills were coming forward too much, so I've mixed up a thin wash of ultramarine and a touch of pink, very watered down, and I'm glazing this very thin wash over that sort of cling film effect that I created earlier. I don't want to disturb the paint underneath, and that's why we use soft haired brushes in watercolour to glaze this sort of thin wash over the top. And it shouldn't look violet, it should just really just cool that colour down and push it back, especially when it's dried. I'm using this same colour to glaze in the foreground here to kind of create some shadow from the clouds above, but also to soften that foreground. I don't want everyone to look at my foreground, I want them to look into my picture. So if the foreground's asking for too much attention, I like to glaze it sometimes so that my eye goes into the painting towards this little white building here. So I'm going to finish off with some darks and details on my focal point using my size 8 brush with a little bit of ultramarine and burnt umber, painting wet on dry, darkening up those windows with a little bit of Paynes grey and the shadow above the door. And to stop myself from overworking the painting, I've decided to spatter some violet mixed with some burnt umber in the foreground to finish this painting. And here is the finished painting with the washi tape removed. Here's a close-up. You can see all the lovely textures made by the salt, the dry brush effect, the spattering, the cling film, the wax resist and the plastic card, and also using the glazing technique to push back those hills and push back the foreground. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and if you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you want to learn more about watercolour painting, get access to exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.